Welcome to Deep Dive. Now, before I start, I want to preface this bit in a tribute to the great Jim Jeffries by saying that in many ways, I think lynching is wrong. In no way do I want you to take what I'm about to say that I'm a fan of lynching. It's evil. Okay? That being said, I do want to talk about the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. Now, it was passed in the House of Representatives on February 26th of this year, but it is just coming into the news because Senator Rand Paul proposed an amendment to it. Now, this has gotten him labeled as a racist, as a Klansman even, as a fan of lynching, but he is definitely not that. He is just trying to give some clarity to the act. He said that he is a fan of the act as long as his amendment is in there. The amendment only clarifies a few things. And he even said, "You think I'm going to get good publicity out of this? No. I'll be excoriated by simple-minded people on the internet who think somehow I don't like Emmett Till or appreciate the history of Emmett Till." He said, "I'll be lectured by everybody." And he's been proven right. He's being torn apart left and right. Now, let's dive into the actual bill. As always, Section 1 names the bill, and Section 2 starts off, "Congress finds the following," which is followed by 22 bullet points ranging in topics of things that this bill means that Congress believes. Now, it starts off with the crime of lynching succeeded slavery as the ultimate expression of racism in the United States following Reconstruction. Number 2 is lynching was widely acknowledged practice in the United States until the middle of the 20th century. See all these facts, but just things that everybody kind of knows, but they want to make sure that people understand, right? Lynching was a crime that occurred throughout the United States with documented incidents in all but 4 states. At least 4,742 people, predominantly African Americans, were reportedly lynched in the United States between 1882 and 1968. Now, there, it specifically says that there hasn't really been a lynching since 1968. I would personally disagree, but as we'll find later, the things that I would consider lynching, this bill wouldn't. But we'll get into that in a minute. With bullet point 5, it says 99% of all perpetrators of lynching escaped from punishment by state or local officials. Now, I completely believe that. I'm sure that they've done their homework. I just think it's kind of an interesting statistic, very hard to prove, especially because this was long before there was any kind of a justice system that worked. Not that there is a justice system that works, but 99%, that is kind of scary. That is a problem. Goes on to list a couple of more things here and there, and then gets a good dig at the Senate with bullet point 10 saying between 1920 and 1940, the House of Representatives passed 3 strong anti-lynching measures. Then going on to say the Senate considered but failed to enact anti-lynching legislation, despite being requested by civil rights groups, presidents, and the House of Representatives. So, getting a little dig that the House has already done this 3 times. This is now the 4th time that the House has passed anti-lynching legislation. The Senate has held it up every single time. Why? Variety of reasons. Honestly, normally because a lot of those times they had a Republican majority and a lot of old racists. It has been a little while since they've tried. It goes on to talk about publications and other things that have brought out the history of lynching or recognized the victims. And then it goes into a few kind of, in my opinion, arbitrary kind of feel-goody things, like only by coming to terms with history can the United States effectively champion human rights abroad. Again, true, but does this stuff belong in legislation? Bullet point 14 is an apology offered in the spirit of true repentance moves the United States towards reconciliation and may become central to new understanding on which improved racial relations can be forged. Now, again, true, but what is the purpose of listing all of this out in a piece of legislation? That's my personal question. It then talks about more statues and monuments that, again, don't really think belongs in legislation. Why is this in here? It takes up 7.5 pages full of these bullet points and then less than a page and a half of actual legislation. And we'll talk about how most of that is hollow and empty as well. Now, bullet point number 20 is where we get into some slightly suggestive or subjective points. Now, I don't disagree with any of the things that are said here, but I personally have some friends that would, although I argue with them repetitively. I think including this kind of divisive bullshit in legislation is ridiculous. It's impractical. It talks about that Donald Trump signed into law Joint Resolution 49, which condemned the racist violence and domestic terrorist attack in Charlottesville in 2017. It then goes on to talk about that resolution and quotes this piece. It says, hundreds of torch-bearing white nationalists, white supremacists, Klansmen, neo-Nazis who chanted racist, anti-Semitic, and anti-immigrant slogans and violently engaged with the counter-demonstrators on and around the grounds of the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. Now, again, I agree. That is what happened. But this kind of stuff it's lip service. It's getting in a win. It's purely just a political win that's saying, yeah, it's now in law. It's been signed by Donald Trump, because if it passes the Senate, he'll have to sign this again, even though he already signed it. They already passed a resolution talking about this BS. It's already gone through this, but they're putting it in again just to get another repeated, see, we already agree that this is true. We're just going to shove it in your face again. Again, I agree with it all, but not necessary. It goes on to talk about a few pieces of the U.S. Federal Code and the Civil Rights Act that we'll actually get into in a little bit when we start the legislative part of this act finally. And with that, Section 3 of the act says Chapter 13 of Title 18 of the United States Code is amended by adding at the end the following. 250, lynching. This says whoever conspires with another person to violate Section 245, 247, or 249 of this title or Section 901 of the Civil Rights Act of 1968 shall be punished in the same manner as a completed violation of such section, except that if the minimum term of imprisonment for such completed violations is less than 10 years, the person may be imprisoned for not more than 10 years. So what that says is any person who conspires with somebody else to do any of these few things, which we will discuss, don't worry, gets punished in the manner of if they had actually completed the act for up to 10 years. Or no more than 10 years, yeah. So, again, this doesn't have a lot to do with lynching. That's what we come to terms with first here. As we'll discuss, those three pieces of the U.S. Code also doesn't. This just means that if you conspire with somebody else to do something, you get charged as if you did it. Specifically, Section 245 of the U.S. Code, which is federally protected activities. It says, whoever, whether or not acting under the color of law, by force or threat of force, willfully injures, intimidates, or interferes with, or attempts to injure, intimidate, or interfere with any person. Goes on to list all of those persons. Gives it a penalty of 10 years. Okay. So, this, as we're going to see in a bit, is Rand's whole problem. So, not only does the Anti-Lynching Act mean that conspiracy to do any of these things is the same as doing it, now we're talking about intimidates. Literally, that's a word. Whoever intimidates, 10 years. Now we have whoever conspires to intimidate, 10 years. This is kind of messed up, guys. Like, this is so broad. This is anything that if they say it's about race, you're fucked, dude. But then it goes on to say, nothing in this section shall be construed as to deter any law enforcement officer from lawfully carrying out the duties of his office. What is this? So the cops can still do this as long as they say they had to complete their job, which, leaving that in there and specifically addressing the pieces of law that say exactly this, because all three bullet points, or all three pieces of the code that we're looking at have that bit in it. Is this what we should be talking about right now, considering what's going on? Or should we be fixing these pieces of this code? Maybe let's amend that. Let's get rid of that. We'll talk about that in a second, too. Now, 247 is damage to religious property. What does that have to do with lynching? Nothing. The only logical explanation I can think of for this is burning a cross. But that's far-fetched, guys, right? I don't really think, especially because it says intentionally defaces, damages, or destroys any religious property because of the religious character of that property, or attempts to do so. So yeah, I mean, a cross, it's not religious property, which literally, it was my only logical explanation. So, in an anti-lynching bill, we're making conspiracy to attempt to damage religious property federally punishable by 10 years. Do you see why this is kind of falling apart? Again, I'm totally against lynching, but what is this? Then Section 249 is hate crime acts. Now we're getting somewhere, right? But number one, in subsection 1 of this is offenses involving actual or perceived race, color, religion, or national origin. Now, according to the NAACP and legal definition, a lynching has to already fall under these categories. So now we're talking about the part of the law that basically already makes lynching illegal. Whoever, whether or not acting under the color of law, willfully causes bodily injury to any person or through the use of fire, firearm, dangerous weapon, explosive, incendiary device, or attempts to cause bodily injury to any person. Boom. As long as it's race, color, religion, or national origin. But it actually then goes on to repeat everything again with religion, national origin, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. So, again, not all about lynching, but directly bolstering all of these laws. So, attempt to commit, again, we have now, if this bill passes, we have the conspiracy with another person to attempt to commit bodily injury to another person is punishable by up to 10 years in federal prison. Now, back to the actual bill. It then just says where this should be found in the U.S. code. And then it talks about budgetary effects, saying that it's all in compliant with the statutory Pay-as-you-go Act of 2010. And that takes up the rest of the legislation. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got an 8-page bill. 6.5 pages are these bullet points. Then this much bolsters huge amounts of legislation, and then the rest is where to find it and some budgetary crap. It's lip service. It's this whole bill. It's called the Antilynching bill. It's got all of these facts about lynching. It makes us feel good about racial equality, which we all should do. Like, all of this stuff, I wish everyone in the country actually agreed with this or believed this. That would be amazing. Fortunately, they don't. But doing this, passing this through Congress, or even having Trump sign it himself, will not turn the country. This is honestly pretty pointless. All it's doing is giving conspiracy to commit any of these things a 10-year federal sentence. Now, this brings up Rand's amendment, which just clarifies this. And I'm going to show you him kind of introducing the amendment, and then also Kamala Harris's response to it. So check this out. Now, Harris's response to me is hilarious. She's like, "Oh, that's enough." Now, Harris's response to this cracks me up, because Rand called her out on something, and her only response was, "That is an insult to me and a bunch of other people." Right? Yeah, it is. He was kind of insulting you. He was saying you are taking lynching like a joke by passing this bill, and he's right. That was an insult. Calling an insult is not really a comeback to an insult. But like I said earlier, is this what's important right now? With what we have going on, we have rioting in the streets every day. We have cops murdering unarmed people, and now with the protesting, even peaceful protesters are getting killed, are getting tear gassed, are losing eyes to rubber bullets. Is this what we should be talking about right now? Or should we be ending qualified immunity? Should we be taking apart those pieces of the U.S. code that I just read to you, that this is bolstering? Should we be taking those pieces apart, especially the part that gives complete immunity to cops that are doing their jobs? This is complete and total lip service. Again, lynching should be a federal crime. If that's what this bill was, I would agree with it. But that's not what it is. And that's why I at least like Rand's amendment. And he said he would support the bill if his amendment was there. All his amendment does is clarify, make sure that this has to be like a serious thing for it to qualify for this. Because I don't want to go to jail for conspiracy to attempt to do anything. Especially with the renewing of the Patriot Act and all the government spying. Just think of how many times you say out loud to your friends some terrible shit. You don't really mean it, but if that was on record, that is conspiracy to attempt to commit something. Man, I would love to just beat that guy up. Like, we shouldn't be thinking like that, and I try my best not to, but we're all human, right? We all say that kind of shit, and this bill literally gives government the authority to throw you in jail for up to 10 years for that shit. Now, the House, it passed like ridiculously high numbers. Okay, only 4 people voted against it, including Amash and Massey, and 16 people, 10 Democrats and 6 Republicans, didn't vote. I find it astounding that that many people actually wanted it passed in the House, because there are more people against it in the Senate than just Rand Paul, which is really interesting because part of the act, it mentions that a 90%, 90 members of the United States Senate agreed to Senate Resolution 39 in 2005, which apologized to the victims of lynching and the descendants of those victims for the failure of the Senate to enact anti-lynching legislation. So the Senate can't pass legislation, but 90% of them can agree to apologize for their inactivity. That resolution could have been a bill that made lynching illegal, but they didn't do that. They just apologized for inaction. Do you get that? Like they literally signed their names to an apology for sucking. And 90 members of the Senate. There's only 100. That's 90%. We can do better than this, guys. Let's actually pass some anti-lynching legislation. Let's make it federally illegal. I'm totally for that. I want to see that right now. Let's also end qualified immunity, but I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the night. Thank you so much for watching another episode of Deep Dive, and we will be right back with more Fight for Liberty after this.